All right, so here we go. We pick up, we're in Acts chapter 13. We're actually 13, verse 13. So just by way of a quick recap, so now we've entered into the section of Acts where the gospel has now opened up beyond the borders of Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and now we're to the ends of the earth. Remember, this was what Jesus said at the beginning, that they will be his witnesses starting in Jerusalem, to Judea, kind of the county surrounding Jerusalem, to Samaria, where Philip went in chapter 8, and now to the ends of the earth. So meaning to the Gentiles, to the Roman Empire. And so in this missionary, this first missionary effort comes really out of the city of Antioch, from the Jewish Christian community in Antioch, which was one of the major towns of the Mediterranean world, had a very large Jewish population. So it's actually from Antioch really becomes kind of the second center of Christianity after Jerusalem. And they send two of their best and brightest, Barnabas and Paul, on this first missionary journey. And then with them goes John Mark, who appears to be Barnabas's cousin. And John Mark is then known as the author of the Gospel of Mark. All right, so this leads into 13. So and then in the beginning of 13, so their first destination, let me see. Can you see this map here? You see this?
Yes.
All right, so their first destination, they come out of Antioch over here, and their first destination is the east coast of Cyprus. And then they travel by foot across Cyprus to the west coast, where they have this meeting with Sergius Paulus, who is the Roman governor of Cyprus. And they have this encounter with this Eliseus Bar Jesus. This seems to be, he's a Jewish magician, it seems, who is somehow connected with Sergius Paulus's court, and they engage in a kind of dispute with him because he's representing some other Jewish perspective, I mean, not believing in Jesus, but he's clearly kind of mixed. He's not representing pure Judaism because he's practicing this kind of magic, and anyway, they have a dispute before Sergius Paulus. And then it seems that Sergius Paulus had some interest in what Paul was saying about Jesus, and perhaps he gives him some letters of recommendation, because their next stop is they take a boat from the west end of Cyprus, northwest, up here. And so then they enter into basically south central Turkey. And this is what missionary journey. Let's see here. All right, so this is what's known as the first missionary journey. All right, so that's where we pick up. So we're going to talk about this a little today, because in the reading from today, we talk about they go into a Jewish synagogue that's located here, outside the Holy Land. And in the scriptures in the New Testament, we really only get two windows into the synagogue. So the one is also by St. Luke, when he depicts in chapter 4 of St. Luke, he depicts Jesus beginning his public ministry by going into the synagogue, right? The synagogue in Galilee, which is north of Jerusalem and Judea. And then this is the second picture we get, a window we get inside synagogue life in the first century. And this is outside the Holy Land. So there's some differences. But I think one of the most interesting things that strikes me is that we have to, the evidence of what synagogue life was like at this time is really fragmentary. We don't really know a lot. A lot of it is detective work and guesswork, but they've actually found and excavated 5 synagogues in the region of Galilee. So this is close to Jerusalem and the Holy Land, the place where Jesus grew up. But there's definitely some Gentile Greek Roman influence in Galilee. And so of the 5 synagogues that archaeologists have found in Galilee that can date to around Jesus's time in the 1st century, they found that there are what we would call icons or images painted in these synagogues, which is interesting. And then and there's all these sorts of parallels between the synagogue life and temple life, and then what Orthodox Christianity, ancient Christianity comes to do, and what we still preserve. There's really this continuity. But in these 5 synagogues in Galilee, they also find representations of Greco-Roman things. So they have like a Medusa head painted in one of the synagogues in Galilee, which for the Greco-Romans was considered kind of this mythological amulet that would scare off evil spirits. This is definitely not a Jewish symbol by any means. So even as close to the Holy Land as Galilee, you have this clear non-Jewish influence in the synagogues. And I think what we're going to see here too, we'll get to it in a second, but we should kind of put away this idea of the synagogues of being these kind of necessary places of pure Judaism. Really, that would probably be limited to Jerusalem and around the temple. And then even there, you have whole groups like Qumran, the Essenes and Qumran, who leave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, who have withdrawn from Jerusalem and the temple service because they feel that it's been corrupted and is not pure enough. So you have these kind of differing levels of pure Judaism, right? But in the synagogues, especially the further you get away from Jerusalem, we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that necessarily what's being represented is this kind of pure Judaism. So we saw that at the beginning of 13 with this Bar Jesus figure who somehow had worked his way into the court of Sergius Paulus because he's practicing magic and he's representing himself as this Jewish figure, Jewish advisor. And then Paul comes in and is offering a very different message about Judaism, that it's been fulfilled in Jesus. All right, so here we go. So that leads us into 13. Now, when Paul and his party, and now this section gets interesting because if you remember, just not long ago, less than a chapter ago, when they set out from Antioch, and the chapters before, it was Barnabas and Paul set out. Barnabas and Paul. That was the order in which they were referred to. And it was really Barnabas who was the bigger figure. He was the one who vouched for Paul in Jerusalem, and it was based on Barnabas's word that Paul was kind of reluctantly accepted. It was Barnabas who goes and finds Paul in Tarsus, where he was for some years, and brings him to Antioch because Barnabas thinks, there's a lot of work here. There's a lot of potential here in Antioch. I need a helper. He thinks of Paul and goes and gets Paul as kind of his assistant. Now, though, when they start on this missionary journey, very quickly, now the language changes to Paul, and now Barnabas isn't even named. Paul and his companions, meaning Barnabas and John Mark. And a lot of commentators, even the fathers, have noticed this shift. And some will say that this is perhaps what leads to John Mark leaving. But we'll see that in a second. So now when Paul and his party set sail from Paphos, the west end of Cyprus, they came to Perga in Pamphylia. And John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. So this is John Mark, the author of the Gospel of Mark. And it doesn't explain why he left. It's just that he returned to Jerusalem. It could have been by a land route now to return to Jerusalem, or he could have taken another ship from that port and gone back to Jerusalem. But later in Acts 15, when Paul is about to embark on his second missionary journey, then John Mark's leaving, his departure comes up then, and St. Luke relates that Paul was disappointed in John Mark for leaving the first time. So, it's kind of left, we don't know what the dispute was or what exactly happened, but some commentators suspect that maybe John Mark felt like Barnabas was being eclipsed by Paul, and Barnabas was his cousin, or we don't know. All right, 14. Now, when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. All right, so if we look at this map here, so they land here in Perga. Perga is actually a few kilometers kind of upriver from the port. And then they make, and really not much is related to us what happened here. And it may be that Sergius Paulus had relatives all in this area, and that maybe they found some hospitality through these letters of recommendation that we're speculating about. They were received here for a few days until they could make their way to take this trip inland into the up country and up into the mountains. And this is a distance of 125 miles that they would cover on foot. So this is more than a week's travel they had to go inland into kind of central Turkey, into Antioch and Pisidia. And Antioch and Pisidia, it has that name, or Pisidian Antioch, because there were a lot of cities in the ancient world named Antioch after Antiochus and his relatives. The biggest and most famous was where they came from, Antioch here in Syria, Antioch on the Orontes. But this is called Antioch, Pisidian Antioch. So this city seems to have, it was a Roman colony. It had about 5,000 Roman citizens. It was the second largest city in Galatia. So this region, basically right around here, this is really in the northwest corner of Galatia. And then Galatia kind of goes over up into the northeast a bit here and then comes down again. It's kind of an odd shape, but it's kind of central, all of central Turkey. It's a fairly large province. And then even over here to the northeast. Why is this important? Because the letter to the Galatians that Paul writes, there's a huge debate. It's not really clear where were these Galatians that Paul was writing to, because normally he writes to the Philippians. Philippi is a city. Corinth is a city. Thessalonica is a city. Galatia is not a city. It's this huge province. So he's writing in an unusual way to this huge province. We're not clear where these were. Most people assume that he means South Galatia and this region here. So that these cities that he's going to visit on his first missionary journey, that he follows up with these after this first missionary journey and writes the letter to the Galatians. But there's another theory that he actually made a visit up north in Galatia for complicated reasons, that he kind of accidentally by necessity ended up on a mission that's not otherwise recorded in North Galatia, and that he was writing to them. The more likely is that he's writing to these cities that he's going to visit now, that we're going to read about now. And he goes in, the first thing he does, he and Barnabas, now it's just the two of them. First thing they do when they enter in the city is that there is a synagogue there. So it's a fairly large city with 5,000 Roman citizens, and then many more than that who are not Roman citizens. The city was the second largest in this big province of Galatia. And it lived off of, this was probably all agriculture here. So it lived off being kind of the administrative capital of a bunch of agriculture. And so it seems that there were also some Jews who, in fact, enough Jews lived in this city to have their own, at least one synagogue that Paul and Barnabas go to immediately on entering the city. And this is part of, it's important that, Luke wants to make sure we know they go directly to the synagogue so that their focus still at this point is they are preaching to the Jews. Their first interest is in offering this message of salvation to the Jews. And it's really only because the Jews reject this message that they turn to the Gentiles. So this is to be faithful to the Lord's command to offer this message to the Jews, but it's also a way of protecting themselves against the claim that they kind of neglected the Jews, that they didn't give the Jews enough of a chance to hear this message. No, they're going to make it clear again and again and again that they presented this message to the Jews, and that only some accepted and some rejected it. It's not that they weren't offered. All right, so it says here, at the end of 14, they entered the synagogue and they sat down. So some people say, okay, that gives us a little tidbit of information that it seems there's some evidence that there were benches along the walls. So all along the walls of the synagogue, not in the middle, but all along the walls, there were benches where people could sit. Now, this is interesting because in the synagogue, the other synagogue description we have in the New Testament in Luke, it tells us that Jesus sat, he read the scriptures that they gave him that day from Isaiah, and then he sat to expound the scriptures. And this is accords with what we know about synagogue practice in the Holy Land, that the custom was that the people would stand or perhaps sit on the floor while the one who was giving the sermon would actually sit in a chair. This is where he would teach from, in a sitting position. But in the Greco-Roman world, the culture was that when you were speaking publicly, you would stand. And then the people would sit. So it seems that there may have been some benches along the walls where people would sit. And then this is interesting when you look at, the Orthodox Church, the kind of traditional setup is you have these stacedia, we call them, kind of benches with armrests all along the walls. In the Russian churches, they still have this too. The seating really is only along the walls. All right, so it says they sat down, and after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them, saying, Men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. Go ahead and speak. All right, so to break this down a little bit. So this is now where we try to reconstruct a little bit. What was the synagogue service like at this time? So it seems that it followed a familiar liturgical pattern that it began with the Shema, they call it, meaning this saying that was a confession of faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And then they would proceed to the what's called the 18 benedictions. So the 18 benedictions, you can see here, I just wanted to give you a little taste. So this is a kind of an attempt at a reconstruction of what they would have looked like in the first century. So the first one is, Blessed are you, Lord, our God and God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, the great God, powerful and revealed, exalted God, owner of heaven and earth, our shield and shield of our fathers, our refuge in all generations. Blessed are you, Lord, shield of Abraham. So these are the benedictions. These are kind of statements. Blessed are you, Lord. And then it gives the reason. But you can see there's also kind of requests built in there, that he's our shield, the shield of our fathers, our refuge. Here it's, you are, second one, you are powerful, humbling the proud, alive forever, raising the dead, sustaining the living, reviving the dead. So it's a statement of why God is blessed, but it's also a kind of a petition or hope. Here, fourth, endow us, our Father, with understanding from you and discernment and insight from your Torah. Blessed are you, Lord, gracious giver of understanding. So you see there's a request built in there too. Forgiveness, grant us repentance, heal us in 8. Then the most controversial one is this 12. For the apostates, let there be no hope, and may the kingdom of the arrogant be quickly uprooted in our days, and may the Nazarim and Minim instantly perish. May they be blotted from the book of the living and not be written with the righteous. Blessed are you, Lord, humbler of the arrogant. Now, this is commonly taken as being specifically put in or adopted to the Christians. So when it mentions the Nazarim or the Minim, that this probably pre-existed Christianity, this kind of curse of the apostates or heretics, as we might say, but that the Christians were particularly added in at some point in the late 1st century, early 2nd century, when they were finally expelled from the synagogue. Here in 13, to the righteous proselytes, in other words, the converts, may your compassion be lavish and give to us a good reward. So this is what the service would have looked something like this that they attended. So first they begin the service with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." They move into these 18 benedictions. It ends with a priestly a blessing. So even though they're far away from Jerusalem where the priests would exercise their ministry in the temple, they still kept track of who had priestly lineage because it was inherited biologically. And the person, if they had someone who had priestly lineage, they would offer the priestly blessing at this time, which I don't know if you guys have heard me on this before. It was they would go like this. I can't do it really well. They would go like this and hold their hands up over the people. Now, why would they do that? It says, because it says it says in the Old Testament that you shall bless in my name. And so this was a representation of the Hebrew of a Hebrew letter that was the first letter in calling God. And so this was a way of blessing in God's name. Now you might recognize this, right? What's this from? Leonard Nimoy, Star Trek. Because Leonard Nimoy was of a priestly family, so he was a priest, and he grew up in a pious Jewish household, and they would offer the priestly blessings at Jewish gatherings. So when he felt like his character should have some kind of, to go sign to go along with this phrase, "Live long and prosper." And so he thought of this, but he thought it would be impious to actually do the same thing. So he broke it in half so that he wasn't being impious toward his Jewish heritage. But it actually comes from the priestly blessing that's still used to this day. So they would have had the Shema, they would have had the 18 benedictions. If there were a priest present, he would have offered the blessing. And then they would have read the scriptures. So you can see already, if you look at our Orthodox service, we begin with what? Blessed is our God. Blessed is the kingdom. Then we enter into the Great Litany, right? Which is about 12 or 14 petitions. And then we have these entrance hymns that came in for another reason. And then we have the scripture readings, which is exactly what he tells us they have here. After the reading of the law and the prophets. So there were two readings, just like we have. The law was from the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books, and there was a lectionary cycle at this point, which was a 3-year cycle where they read the same order of selections from the Pentateuch over 3 years. And then there was a selection from the prophets, meaning basically everything not in the first 5 books and not in the Psalms. From Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., Ezekiel, there was a passage that was selected, probably because it related somehow to the reading from the Torah, from the law. Now, what do? We have a reading from the gospel. There was also a procession before they read it. They had a procession in which the scroll of the Torah came in. We have that too. And then we have an epistle reading, which is usually selected. There's a cycle, but sometimes they're selected because they combine. They have the same point as the gospel reading. So you can see this continuity in our worship. So so they read the law, the prophets, and then someone would speak. Now here, when it says the rulers of the synagogue, so the rulers of the synagogue would be something like, I like to try to give some analogies so that we can kind of understand what it was like. So the rulers of the synagogue would be something like parish council. So they were lay people. At this time, it doesn't seem that there was necessarily anyone, there was like a full-time rabbi associated with the synagogue. It seems really that the synagogues were, especially the further you get away from Jerusalem, were really more like Jewish community centers. And I think a good analogy might be, if you look at how the Orthodox churches started here in America, it wasn't a planned mission, for example, like where we would go to Africa and we would be preaching to the native Africans and we want to construct a church, etc. This was more like how Orthodoxy came to America with the Russians and the Serbians and the Greeks, and didn't necessarily intend to stay here for a long time. They felt a strong connection to their homeland. But so they kind of formed after a few years. They realized, okay, we're not leaving yet. They formed a kind of a community center. And that's really what the first Orthodox churches in America usually were more like Greek community centers. And they would focus on things like studying the Greek language. Of course, there wasn't any distinction really between culture and religion. This is really a very Western, modern Western concept that really hadn't even penetrated Greece, even in the late 18, early 1900s. It was inconceivable that there was this big distinction between the two. So the same in the synagogues here. The culture and the religion are the same thing. So you can kind of think of what the early parishes looked like. What happened in the early parishes? They were, the lay people who were the most involved in trying to raise money or donating money themselves were kind of on the parish council, kind of administered things. A lot of times, even in the parishes here in the U.S., there was a long period where there was really very little supervision from any bishops. There were no local bishops here on the ground. They were all in the old country. So there's very little supervision. You have some strange things sometimes happening where there would be kind of wandering priests and they would say, hey, can you come and do a service for us? And they would have a bunch of baptisms and funerals that had stacked up. So they would give him something for his time. He would stay for a few days, do some services. It may what's the word? He may or may not be a canonical priest. They're just wandering. There's very little supervision, right? And it was just these lay people who are not necessarily trained, who they say, oh, here's a priest. It comes in town. Oh, can you do a service for us? Sounds like he knows what he's doing. They don't know any credentials. They don't even know to ask for any credentials. So the same thing in the synagogues at this time, because you would kind of wonder, these guys just show up and they're like, hey, you want to preach today? I mean, it seems kind of strange to us, but one, there was much less supervision in general in the synagogues. They didn't have a system of kind of overseers or anything like that. This comes from the Christian church. So it was hard to have any kind of uniformity. And so you can imagine these people, they say, well, maybe Paul was a trained rabbi. Perhaps he was dressed in a distinctive way that indicated that he was a rabbi. And that's why they notice him. Maybe he has introduced himself when he comes in. We're not really sure. But in any event, these rulers of the synagogue, who are probably people who have who are generous donors and help in the running of this kind of community center / synagogue, they ask Paul and Barnabas, would you like to say something about the scriptures that were just read? Everyone with me? Any questions? All right, so it says 16. Then Paul stood up and motioning with his hand said, all right, so what probably this means is that in the Greco-Roman context, not in the Holy Land, but in the Greco-Roman context, when you stood up to speak, you made a sign like this with your hand. And you held it up, and this signaled to everyone, I'm preparing to speak. Everyone, please be quiet. Lend me your ear. Now, this is, again, a Greco-Roman custom, but Paul, because he's a Roman citizen, because he has dual training, because he's grown up in a Greco-Roman environment, educated, but also has taken his religion very seriously and has studied that, he's got a foot in both worlds. And so it kind of makes sense that Paul's the one now who starts to take the lead once they're outside of the Holy Land, because he's familiar with the customs. So he stands up and says, men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. So, and that's interesting. Men of Israel, first of all, so he's talking about fellow Israelites, fellow Jews. But then he says, and you who fear God. And this is kind of not exactly a technical term, but there's this whole category of people we've talked about several times in the past who were interested. These were Gentiles who were interested in the Jewish religion and chose to hang around the synagogue, would attend services, would listen to the scripture readings, etc. But may or may not be actually full converts or proselytes, as they say. A proselyte technically would mean more of a full convert. So, men of Israel and you who fear God, listen. So he's acknowledging that in the synagogue in this place, there are some people who aren't Jews. They're Gentiles, but are interested in Judaism. And it's among these people in particular that Christianity is particularly successful. 17. The God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt. And with an uplifted arm, he brought them out of it. So he's talking about the Exodus. Now, for a time of about 40 years, he put up with their ways in the wilderness. Now, so this is interesting. So he's talking about the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And this version translates it as he put up with their ways. Here, let's see, he says, he bore with them the same. He put up with them. Okay, interesting. Because actually there's a problem in the manuscript and the words, the difference in Greek in the words put up with and sustained or nurtured them is a very small difference. And it seems to be actually a quote from the Old Testament. I think it's Deuteronomy 1:31. And so even in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of Deuteronomy 1:31, it's the same problem, that some manuscripts have one and some have another. But so in any event, it's clear that Luke here or Paul, who's making the speech, is quoting from the Septuagint. To me, the more likely seems that actually that he, not that he put up with, but that he sustained or nourished with them, because he's really emphasizing in this part of the speech God's kindness to the people. But anyway, it's a small difference. So during the 40 years in the wilderness, both are accurate because he did sustain them and he did also have to put up with them because they were very difficult for 40 years. He put up with their ways in the wilderness. And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land to them by allotment. So, the Bible tells us that there was this period of some years, it wasn't instantaneous, in which there were 7 different peoples that were living in the promised land in Canaan, like the Hittites, and the last one was the Jebusites. The Jebusites were the ones who lived in Jerusalem, and they were the last to be conquered by David. This took place over a period of years as they fully seized the promised land. So Paul he's recounting the history of Israel in a very kind of short form. All right. And 20. And after that, he gave them judges for about 450 years until Samuel the prophet. So this is the period they're without a king. This is the period of judges, like the title of the Old Testament book. Really, the judges are kind of more military leaders who administer Israel, but they don't have the title of king because God is their king. Until Samuel the prophet. And afterward, they asked for a king, which Samuel was initially opposed to. After they asked for a king, in which God was, maybe it's not the way, kind of offended by, because God was their king. He was going to rule them directly, but they wanted to be like the other peoples, the other settled nations, and have their own king. And so God kind of reluctantly gives in to the request, although he would have preferred them to want him to be their king directly. So, and afterward they asked for a king. So God gave them Saul, the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years. So this is Saul, whom Paul, we know from his letters, that he was from the tribe of Benjamin. His original name was Saul, undoubtedly named after this Saul, the first king. Now he says that he was king for 40 years. There's some debate about that. The scriptures, it's not clear. There's based on oral tradition. So some sources say 40 years, some say it was 20 years. The interesting thing, I think, in general about these speeches, like the sermon of Peter, the sermon of Stephen, now this sermon of Paul, all of them incorporate oral tradition. So you had the written tradition, the written law, and then you had all this that was traced to Moses, and then you had the oral tradition which amplified or clarified the law. And this was also the rabbis, the Pharisees, traced this also to Moses, and this was passed down by word of mouth from rabbi to rabbi. And then this is part of what Jesus critiques, and he critiques the Pharisees, but Jesus doesn't critique all of the oral tradition. He critiques some of what he perceives as excesses of the Pharisees and in their amplification of the oral tradition and their application of the oral tradition, but he doesn't condemn all oral tradition, although Protestants tend to read him as condemning all oral tradition. Anything the Pharisees said was just by nature wrong. If it wasn't written down, then it was no good. I mean, but in the context of the first century for Jesus and the early Christians, that's just nonsense. They wouldn't have even thought of it in that way. I mean, and in all these speeches, they incorporate oral tradition. They actually, like this oral tradition that he reigned for 4 years. That's not in the scripture. That's not in the Old Testament. But now it's in the scripture because it's in the New Testament. It's in Acts and their speeches. And so the Protestants will accept it. But, it doesn't really make any sense that, I mean, that was oral tradition. There's all these cases of Christians, Paul, Luke here in Acts, all using and incorporating oral tradition and referring to it on the same level with no distinction as the written tradition. But Protestants now will say, they'll make some, okay, this is written tradition because it made it into the New Testament. So we accept this, but the other oral tradition that just happens not to be mentioned, no, that's all, and any oral tradition that the church has, of course, that's wrong because Jesus condemned it, supposedly. Nejwa?
Yes. Can I ask you, I always wondered, since Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, since he began from Adam and Eve and all the history, now was that all recorded? Was that not oral tradition? Since we don't have proof that they wrote from before the days of Abraham, like the Genesis account and Noah's account and all that. So was it that Moses received it from the Lord, or what Moses repeating the oral tradition according to his forefathers and what they related from generation to generation? I always wondered, although I know Moses was educated, so he was able to do all that, but I wondered where the source of information was it whether that was oral tradition. And since they were slaves for that many, for 400 years, did they really continue reading and writing, or was there reading and writing before Jacob and his family went down to Egypt? I often wondered.
This is a great question. I mean, this has to do with, again, it's from the Protestant movement, which grows out of modernity. Protestantism is tied, it's part and parcel with the Enlightenment, with modernity, with the printing press. And so since modernity, the culture has shifted 180 degrees, where we have this real reliance on the written word, right? The written word. And that's Protestantism. The problem is that kind of attitude is just inconceivable any time before the invention of the printing press. That we know that everything was oral, that all these stories were passed down orally, like Homer's stories. Homer is 700 BC. So all these stories were passed down orally. There was a kind of profession of the storyteller. I mean, certain people who would kind of specialize, and they had all these tricks and methods for remembering stories orally. Like Aristotle wrote many treatises on how to memorize things. So they had all these, mnemonic devices, etc. And actually, the studies have shown that these oral cultures, that it's incredible how accurate they are at passing down the story. That the oral tradition actually was extremely accurate. We don't tend to think of it that way because we've lost the whole art of memorizing, because we're spoiled with easy access to written.
Isn't it like the bards that used to travel and tell stories of heroic actions and so on? And that bard's tradition actually still remains in the Middle East.
Yeah.
My grandfather used to sit and recite poetry for 2 hours about the story of some hero that won battles, and that because he couldn't read and write, actually. He just recited, and he was well known for telling us as children these stories for several hours at a time.
This was, yeah, this was everywhere until the invention of the printing press, and then, you know, more recently radio and television. This was how people were entertained, how people were educated. So yeah, this is another one of my pet peeves. I mean, you know, it's not based in any factual reality. These Protestant criticisms, you know, well, it has to be in the written text. Well, I mean, the Old Testament was for centuries passed down orally. I mean, the Gospels didn't, you know, weren't put to paper for at least, let's say, 30 years or something like that. So what happened in these times, you know, if there wasn't a written text? I mean, they don't address this problem. So, but it's really all a result of the modern times, modernity. All right, so if Paul is recounting this history of Israel, and he said, so for the 40 that Saul reigned for 40 years. This is oral tradition. 22. And when he had removed him, in other words, when God had removed Saul, God raised up for them David as king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will. From this man's seed, David's seed, according to the promise, God raised up for Israel. Okay, so now what's he saying here? He's talking about the Davidic covenant, the promise or covenant with David that's recorded in I think 2 Samuel, where God promises, you know, David has this inclination. We started to talk about a little bit on the sermon on Sunday with when we were reading Stephen's speech and this reference to the temple. So there is no permanent temple until the time of David. So 1,000 years almost after Abraham. And David is the first, now that they've settled in Jerusalem, he is the first to conceive. He says, look, now I've built myself this palace and God is still in a tent. How can this be? You know, it's not right. And God never really wanted a temple. He wanted to be mobile with his people. He didn't want to be pinned down, but he recognized David's good intent. You know, David's intent wasn't to kind of put God in a box. David's intent was, how can I have a palace and God be in a tent, right? And so God concedes and says, okay, he'll allow for a temple to be built. But he actually says, when David's saying, I'm going to build you a house, God comes back and says to Samuel, no, I'm going to build you a house, meaning I promise that your house, your lineage will rule forever, that the seed of David will be the eternally king of Israel. This was the promise to David. Now, by this time, by the first century, you know, it had been many, many centuries since someone from David's seed had been king, right? And so, but God had made this covenant, a promise, and yet many centuries now, the king is not from David's seed. But we know that God is righteous, God is just. In other words, he's faithful to his promises. So Paul says, from this man's seed, according to that promise, God raised up for Israel a savior, Jesus. So Paul's saying, look, Jesus is the fulfillment of that promise that was made to David 1,000 years ago, 1,000 BC, about that. Raised up, and the word raised up, egiro, is one of the words that's used for God raising Jesus from the dead. So God raised up, but he also says, you know, elsewhere he'll use this this phrase, God will raise up a prophet, God will raise up a king from David's seed. But Paul is connecting that words and saying, look, God literally raised up someone, not just in this kind of figurative sense, but he actually raised him from the dead to fulfill his promise and to be the eternal king of David's line. So God raised up for Israel's Savior Jesus after John had first preached, before his coming, the baptism of repentance to all the people of Israel. And as John was finishing his course, his race, his road, he said, who do you think that I am? I am not he. But behold, there comes one after me, the sandals of whose feet I am not worthy to loose. So again, this is part of a tradition where, because in the first century, John the Baptist was much more famous than Jesus. John the Baptist in the Jewish world, and then even outside of the Holy Land, we're going to see later in Acts that Paul meets some people in modern day Turkey who have been baptized in John's baptism and had never even heard of Jesus. This is all the way in Turkey. So that's why you'll see repeated in the Gospels, and here again, that remember, John said that I am less than he. I'm only his forerunner. Because to the average person who's hearing this, they've heard of John the Baptist. He's famous. They haven't heard of Jesus. So he's pointing out, John the Baptist actually said, I'm less than this one who's coming, Jesus. And I'm not even worthy to touch his sandals, which, the feet in Middle Eastern culture are considered very unclean. And it was only a slave would deal with the master's feet, with taking off his sandals when he came and washing his feet. It was the lowest of the low positions to deal with the dirt of the feet. And so look at this humility. They remember this quote from John the Baptist because to show the level of humility that this famous John the Baptist had in relation to Jesus. 26, men and brethren. So Paul's continuing. Men and brethren, sons of the family of Abraham. So again, in other words, fellow Jews, Israelites, and those among you who fear God. Again, he's acknowledging that there are Gentiles in the crowd. To you, the word of this salvation has been sent. So in other words, he's making it clear, I have come all this way. I have come here specifically to announce to you this good news and to invite you to accept Jesus. For those, so all the way in this Jewish diaspora, far from Jerusalem. For those who dwell in Jerusalem and their rulers, because they did not know him, nor even the voices of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath, have fulfilled them in condemning him. So now remember, he's been asked to come up and speak after the reading of the law and after the reading of the prophets. And so he's saying, I've come all the way to you out here in the diaspora of Judaism because our fellow Jews who are in Jerusalem, which is supposedly the pure center of Judaism, the rulers, the leaders of the Jewish people, and the people of Jerusalem themselves have rejected Jesus. Now, remember, early in Luke's gospel, Luke makes it clear, really, it was the rulers who are responsible for rejecting Jesus. And he kind of gives the people of Jerusalem a pass. They were misled. But that's why Jesus directs his disciples to preach first in Jerusalem. He's giving them a second chance. In Stephen's sermon, he talks about this. So Stephen's sermon, he talks about this, this was actually the part that was skipped in the reading we did on Sunday, just because it was too long, I imagine. But in that part of Stephen's speech, you remember, he talks about Joseph and Moses, and he makes the point that in both cases, Joseph and Moses were rejected by the Jewish people the first time they appeared to them. So remember, Joseph, he was not recognized. They didn't know Joseph the first time they went to Egypt. And it's only in the second time that Joseph makes himself known to them. Same with Moses. When Moses stepped in and killed the Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew slave, they say, who made you a ruler over us? Are you going to kill us now like you killed the Egyptian? And Moses flees. And he goes into the desert, according to the oral tradition, which Stephen cites, for 40 years. And then he comes back a second time, and now the people accept him. So it's the same pattern with Jesus. Jesus appeared the first time to the people in Jerusalem. They rejected him. Then they gave them a second chance. So Peter's speech and Stephen's speech was the second chance for people to recognize Jesus. Some did, and some didn't. But after that second chance, that's it. Now we're moving on. So the same thing he's saying here. He's saying, look, it's not just the rulers who rejected Jesus. Now, after Stephen's persecution, the people in Jerusalem also have rejected Jesus definitively because they did not know him, nor the voice of the prophets, which are read every Sabbath. In other words, Paul's saying that Jesus is predicted and foreshadowed in the prophets, and the prophets also predict that the people are not going to recognize him, that they're going to reject him. And so they don't recognize him in the prophets and have fulfilled the prophets in condemning him. So you see this irony. 28. And though they found no cause for death in him, and again, Luke wants to make clear that Jesus was innocent. He even has the centurion, instead of saying, like in Mark and Matthew, the centurion at the cross in Mark and Matthew says, truly this man was the Son of God. In Luke, he says, truly this man was innocent. So Luke really focuses on this innocence of Jesus, and that he died unjustly, but for the sins of those who really should be condemned. And though they found no cause for death in him, they asked Pilate that he should be put to death. Now, when they had fulfilled all that was written concerning him, so in other words, when they had ironically fulfilled the prophets by not recognizing him as the one foretold in the prophets, and thus condemning and rejecting him as foretold in the prophets, they took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb. The word there, tree, is xylo, which you notice in the hymns that we sing, especially during Holy Week, and then again on September 14th when we commemorate the cross. A lot of times we refer in the hymns to the cross not as the stavro, but as the xylo, the wood, which could mean in ancient Greek tree or wood. And that is the exact word used in Deuteronomy when it says that cursed is he who hangs on a tree, on the wood, xylo. So again, he's showing that Jesus fulfills, he becomes a curse for us in order to redeem us from the curse. They took him down from the tree and laid him in a tomb, but God raised him from the dead. He was seen for many days by those who came up with him from Galilee to Jerusalem, who are his witnesses to the people. And we declare to you glad tidings, that promise which was made to the fathers, meaning to the fathers, to the ancestors of you and us, to the ancestors of the Jewish people. And he's talking specifically here about the promise. Elsewhere, Paul talks about the promise made to Abraham, the covenant with Abraham. But here he's probably talking about the promise made to David, that he would put a king. David's line would be the eternal king of Israel. And of course, the glad tidings. We declare to you the glad tidings is, here it is, evangelizomethos, the evangelize. We evangelize. We are gospeling that promise which was made to the fathers. God has fulfilled this for us, their children, the ancestors' children, in that he has raised up Jesus. As it is also written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So where do we hear that? We hear a theophany, which is coming up. The voice from the heaven comes, and from the second Psalm, you are my son, today I've begotten you. That's why actually originally, it's kind of complicated, but originally Christmas was, of all the major feasts of the church, it was the last of the major feasts of the church to be added. And originally Theophany was the bigger feast. And it was actually kind of combined with Christmas. Christmas was part of Theophany because it all involved the Epiphany, or Theophany as we prefer to call it, this manifestation of God. So his birth was his manifestation in the flesh, and then Theophany was his manifestation to the public, because it was there that the voice said, today I've begotten thee. And it was the manifestation of the Trinity. So actually, for that reason, they were actually combined. It was only later that they split them up and then added these 12 days of feast in between them.
Father, in Spain, when I was in Spain, if I may interject, they actually, their big celebration is the 6th of January.
Yeah.
And they have parades, and that's when they exchange gifts. And they really recognize that as the bigger feast than the Christmas itself, and it amazed me when I was there that while I was during Christmas season, that was the big day in Spain, and everybody was in the streets greeting one another, and the beautiful processions, and the kings, also the visiting of the kings, the three magi.
Yeah.
And that's when they exchanged the gifts.
That's interesting. I mean, it makes a ton of sense because that's the older tradition. It's really probably not until maybe the 4th century that Christmas becomes independent holiday on a different day. But they still connect them, you see, because they're connected by the 12 days of feasting. So in the mind of the church, they still kind of are one feast in some ways, but they've just been doubled so that we can celebrate twice as much. All right, so there.
Father,
Yeah.
I think that I think it's Russian Christmas also, January 6th.
Yeah, so this is a lot of confusion. So Russian Christmas is January.
Yeah, we used to
7th.
celebrate it at St. Simeon's.
Russian.
Celebrated at St. Simeon's.
Okay, so it actually has nothing to do with this. So
Yeah.
Russian Christmas is January 7th, not the 6th, because of the old calendar, new calendar distinction. So, and this only has been true since 1922. Before 1922, there was only the old calendar, all the Orthodox celebrated together on what we would call January 7th, which according to the old calendar is actually December 25th. There's a 13-day difference. But what happened in 1922 is that some of the Orthodox, the Greeks and some others, but not the Russians and the Serbians, adopted this modified new calendar, which is more like the Western calendar, except when it comes to Pascha. And that changed. That made the difference, so that you actually have the majority of Orthodox Christians in the world today celebrating on the old calendar because of the Russians, who can constitute the majority. But it's because of this 13-day difference in the calendars, but not because of anything to do with Theophany. So they celebrate Theophany on January 19th.
Also on the 15th of August, which we now celebrate, they celebrated on the 28th.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. So that adds another layer of confusion, unfortunately. Yeah.
Why do the Greek Orthodox use the old calendar for Easter, but not for Christmas?
That's a good question. I'm not, the calendar issue is like a huge controversy. You have people who have split from the church over it and formed these old calendarist groups, they call them. So it's a complicated issue, but it appears in 1922, the motive was, it was in the air at that time, this move toward Christian unity, especially as you have Orthodoxy really for the first time existing in the West. It's only a couple decades since Orthodoxy really has any presence in America or England because of immigration. So you have this first kind of real contact between the East and the West, and there's this desire on the part of some of the Greek Orthodox leadership to create a bridge between the East and the West toward unity. But then there were, of course, some who resisted changing anything. And so it's called the old calendar is called the Julian calendar, and the new is the Gregorian calendar. And so the compromise was that the new calendar, we don't actually fully subscribe to the Gregorian. It's actually called the revised Julian, because in every respect it's on the Gregorian, the Western calendar, except for Pascha. So I think this was an attempt at a compromise with the Orthodox who didn't want to change at all, to say, okay, still the most important feast we're going to celebrate on the calendar, because there's an issue that this was actually decided, the calculation of Pascha was specifically decided in the First Ecumenical Council. So there was a council decision how it had to be calculated. So perhaps that was the reason for this attempted compromise. So, and that's why we have such a difference with the West on Pascha, is because the main big reason is because we still use the old calendar and can only for calculating Pascha. And it has to do also with, it has to do with the first moon first full moon after Jewish Passover that we still insist on, but the West does not. So anyway, it's
And then sometimes also, Father, doesn't the Jewish Passover fall because of their calendar differences in addition to ours? Their Passover sometimes will actually fall just, not very often, just after when we celebrate the Paschal feast. One or two times it has actually begun and not completed.
okay. Yeah, that could be because it's an 8-day feast. But so I think the First Ecumenical Council said that our Pascha has to be after the beginning of their Passover on the 14th of Nisan, on the lunar calendar, whereas the West stopped using that. So which is why you can have such early Western Easters that are like way before, sometimes weeks before Jewish Passover.
It gets really confusing those years.
Oh yeah.
Well, the explanation, if I may, that Julian calendar was established by Julius Caesar, and then the Gregorian was by Gregory the Fifth of Rome, Pope Gregory. And so I've been asked that question before when in the gatherings to tell the difference and why.
Yeah.
And so, and just know the historical background that it was Julius Caesar who established the original calendar, and then it was improved upon or renewed by Pope Gregory the Fifth of Rome.
Which is like around 1500 or something like that. It's much later. And so currently there's a 13-day difference, but over time it's going to grow to 14 days and then 15 days because, like the leap year, the Julian calendar doesn't have a leap year. The leap year was part of an attempt to render a supposedly more accurate astronomical year. So
Do you think it'll ever come together?
On the issue of Pascha or in general?
No,
The issue of Pascha.
I don't will.
It has to be after the Jewish Passover, the first moon. I don't think they'll change that.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think it would be actually more likely for them to for us to have unity with the Catholics before we change Pascha. I would actually say. And if you look at the history of Christianity, the dating of Pascha has always been an extremely controversial issue. It was like really the first big heresy, the Quartodeciman heresy, Quartodeciman meaning the 14th. This was like early 2nd century huge Christian split. There were some who were more kind of maybe Jewish in their thinking, who actually said that Pascha had to fall on Jewish Passover itself, regardless of the day of the week, just like Jewish Passover. Whereas the others who ended up winning said, no, it's got to be the first Sunday after the beginning of Passover.
It's a good thing they put that down in the very first ecumenical council.
Yeah.
From the very beginning.
All right, so that we'll stop here. So he was saying, all right, yeah, we ended on 33, where he's saying that you are my son, today I've begotten you. And then we'll pick up on verse 34 when we come back. Let's see. Yeah, I think actually, I don't know if we're meeting next week or not. I'll send you a message because that should be January 5th, where we're going to have the service in the morning for the royal hours and then the Vesperal liturgy. So maybe in 2 weeks. All right.
Bye, Father. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. God bless
Happy New Year. Thank you, Father.
Very good.
Father.
Thank you.